Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be taking another look at the Eternals now that I've finished all three parts of the epic quest for those characters and gotten them fully upgraded. As you might have seen from my previous video, all three characters have a lot of potential in both PvE and PvP, and I'm going to be taking a look at some of the higher end modes like ABX and Alliance Conquest and show you how those characters perform in those modes. Though I should mention that Ikaris actually isn't so great in PvE, but he is very dominant in PvP with a proper build and the right team. As always, these are what my card stats look like, and all my testing is based off these numbers. As a quick reference to show you how much better Ikaris got with his uniform and then with his T3, this is how he performed when he was just at T2 with no uniform, finishing with 1 minute and 7 seconds remaining, and this is with no damage proc and a CTP of regen. Then with the uniform he finishes 1 minute faster, and then with the uniform and the T3 upgrade he finishes about 50 seconds faster. I mentioned all the rotations in the previous video, but if you want a refresher, Ikaris is pretty easy. You just do 3, cancel 5, and then after you see those lines appear, you go into your 4th skill. With the ultimate active, you replace the 4th skill with the 6th skill instead, and then go back into the rotation that I just mentioned. You're obviously free to build him for whatever mode you want, but I would highly advise to build him for PvP, since you'll get the most value out of him in that mode. If you really want to use him in PvE, then I would advise trying out a CTP of Destruction, since you can get value out of him in PvP as well with that build. Cersei, without her uniform and upgrade, finished with 1 minute and 21 seconds remaining, and this again was with no damage proc and an invincible obelisk. Then when you equip her uniform, she gets about a 50-second improvement. After awakening and transcending her, you'll see a further improvement of about 1 minute and 25 seconds like I did. Sersi is a little bit difficult to play properly in PvE because she's really dependent on her 3rd skill that has that damage accumulation for damage taken. With that in mind, the rotation that you more than likely would want to use is to kind of wait till the moment where you're just about to get hit, then you use your 3rd skill and you kind of just spam all your skills at once, so you do something like your 4th and your 5th skill. And then, if you have her awakened, you would probably do something like the 3rd skill and the 6th skill first, and then your 4th and 5th. This rotation is based off a single skill damage proc, so if you have something like a rage build and want to use her specifically for PvE, then you can spam in your other skills like the 1 and 2 as well, since they can stack on top of the other skills. For my initial testing with Makkari, I didn't use a damage proc, so I only have an invincible obelisk with guard break immunity, and unfortunately I forgot to test Makkari at level 70 without her uniform, so I don't have that data, but I did test her at 60 with and without the uniform, and the level of improvement was about 1 minute, so that should still hold true at level 70. It should be somewhere around 60 seconds of improvement. But yeah, without the upgrade I finish with almost 2 minutes and 30 seconds remaining, and then with the awakening and transcendence I'm able to finish it over 1 minute faster. The rotation that I used on her throughout the video is a 3, delay, cancel 4, cancel 5. And with the awakening unlocked, it would be the same thing, but you would use your 6 first before going into the 4 and 5. So it would be 3, delay, cancel, 6, cancel, 4, cancel, 5. I've heard some people say that this rotation doesn't work well on a single skill damage proc because the 3 might proc the rotation early, so you wouldn't end up proccing on the 5th skill like you want. So instead I've heard that a rotation that's easier to use with a single skill damage proc is to not use the 4 and just do 3, delay, cancel, 5. However, if you want to squeeze out the most damage from the rotation and still use something like a CTP of energy, then you could try to start off the rotation when you have 1 second left on your proc, so before it runs out you can start your 3, delay, cancel, and then go into your rotation, so you end up proccing more on the skill that you want, since there is a little bit of a wind up going into that rotation. Alternatively, if you don't really want to mess around with the timing on the procs, you could just equip a CTP of Rage on her if you want her specifically for PvE. I've also seen online that a lot of people are really hyping up this character, and some are even claiming that she's being overhyped, and I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration because the character is surprisingly good in PvE content, but also PvP, like you'll see shortly. To put into perspective just how good Makkari is in PvE, this is a stage 25 clear of null, where I am using 2 supports, where one of them is basically acting like a leadership because of the female restriction from stage 25 to 29. If you look in the top left corner, you'll see that I only have that orange buff, which is from her artifact, because I got lucky in one of the chest openings, but I don't have a green buff, which is that damage proc. So I don't have a damage proc for this clear. And yet, with no damage proc, I am able to clear a stage 25 of null, something that I can easily say I can't do with some of the other characters that I have, some even that do have a damage proc. Because I was testing Makkari in PvP content, I decided to equip a CTP of Greed on her, since I feel like that was the best option for a hybrid build, and you can see the level of improvement that a CTP of Greed has in the same clear. So you'll see that with the CTP of Greed, I am able to clear about a minute faster, which isn't anything too drastic, since if I was to use something like a CTP of Rage or a CTP of Energy, that would easily go a minute and 30 seconds faster, or possibly even 2 minutes. But I didn't go this route because of my initial testing, the one from the previous video, led me to believe that she does have potential in PvP once you build her fully, which was the case, as you'll see in a little bit. Though I do suspect that due to her ability to get a high score in ABX, I'm assuming that a large majority of players will likely build her for PvE. That and the fact that she can do World Boss Legends so well, and likely easily one-shot Danger Room Extreme bosses. In this test that I did during the no restrictions day with her, I managed to score about 9.2 million, though I did have to swap to another character to activate that burn effect in order to stop the Frost Beast from lowering my damage from his roar mechanic. This means that during the week when paralysis is the mechanic for stopping the roar, she should be one of, if not the best characters for that week. And I suspect that if you're running something like a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Rage, you should be able to break that 10 million mark, or possibly even get past 10.5 million with some players who have absolutely stacked builds, possibly pushing into the 11 million mark. I also took her into a quick test of Danger Room Extreme with a suboptimal team, i.e. not so great leadership and no support. And I'm pretty sure I would have almost one-shot the boss even with the CTP of Greed, getting her down to about almost 3/4 health. But in this clip, I only got down to around the halfway mark before her interrupt or kind of dangerous mechanics started to kick in. I'm fairly confident that with a CTP of Energy or a Rage, you should be able to one-shot the boss. I pretty much only play this once a day, so this is essentially a non-issue for me. Makkari isn't the only character that has some potential in PvE this update. Sersi is one of the other characters that does really well in PvE, but like I mentioned previously, she is a little bit difficult to play. That's mostly in part to trying to take damage at certain points, and if you have a single skill damage proc like a CTP of Energy, then it becomes a little bit tricky trying to time the third skill and all of your other skills before you proc incorrectly on a skill that you don't want. However, if you are able to proc successfully on the skill that you want, the damage that she deals is quite high. The current build that I'm testing on her is a CTP of Destruction, since she got a revive mechanic added to her with her artifact that combos very well with her awakening skill. You can see here that if you time your skills correctly, you can easily do over 7 health bars of damage. Unfortunately, with a damage accumulation for damage taken mechanic, she likely won't really do much for players in ABX, since other characters that have damage accumulation for damage dealt essentially have that accumulation at a max value every time that that skill is up, whereas for her, she doesn't have that. So trying to get a high score with this character likely won't work out that well. Of the 3 characters, Ikaris is the worst one that you could build for PvE since he has the lowest potential to push high stages of World Boss Legend, as well as clearing the other World Boss ultimates in a very short amount of time. You can see here that with his own leadership and 2 supports, he still isn't able to clear stage 14 of Null, whereas Makkari and Cersei could both clear stage 25 of Null. Even though they did have a damage proc, they were also missing a leadership. And besides that, Makkari could clear stage 25 of Null even with no damage proc. I also took Ikaris into ABX just for the sake of it, but as you can see here, I get to about the minute and 30-second mark with roughly around 2.9 to 3 million score, which means that by the end of the fight I should end up with around 6 million score, which to put into perspective isn't really that great since Hyperion, which is very similar to the equivalent character, can score around the 8 million mark with no damage proc as well. However, even though Ikaris falls short on the PvE aspect, he is a real powerhouse on the PvP side, and he's arguably in the top 10 depending on the characters that are banned that week in Timeline Battle. I mentioned previously that Ikaris scores less than Hyperion in ABX, and that's mostly due to the fact that decreased damage is in fact replaced in his kit with increased survival. He gets up to 55% damage mitigation if you have his uniform equipped, which if you combine that with his passive healing of 4% every second, and other characters like Sersi that gives him even more additional mitigation, or possibly using a CTP of Authority with a steal effect, makes him very tanky in PvP content. At this point, you could be wondering whether the CTP of Authority with a steal effect is the best PvP option for him, and I would say that it really comes down to preference. A CTP of Regen can work just as well, since it really increases his passive healing, and therefore increases his survival, and because Ikaris goes into his 4th skill frequently, which already has that invincible, it kind of combos well with the regen. So basically, if you have the option between a steal CTP of Authority or a penetration CTP of regen, it really comes down to your preference. They both function very similarly, and you can't really go wrong with either. Due to his prolonged skill animations and because of his high survival, I could argue that you could also try out a CTP of Destruction, since if you combo that with his artifact where he iframes frequently, you can essentially have iframe on all skills and penetration on all skills, which makes him kind of like a pseudo native tier 2. And not to gloat or anything, but the reason that I'm posting my current record in Timeline Challenger is to show you just how useful Ikaris is, since this week in Challenger Timeline, a lot of the top metas and counters to Doom are banned, so Sentry, Quicksilver, and Daredevil, Luke Cage as well, are all banned, which makes Ikaris one of the best counters for this week, and, like I mentioned previously, arguably one of the top 10 characters in Timeline, again, depending on which characters are banned. If I was to gloat a little bit, I'd say that I'm the only player currently in Challenger with a perfect win streak, whereas all other players I believe have at the minimum 2 losses or many more. And the reason that I mention that is because I don't believe that many players have successfully gone through the full epic quest for Ikaris to get him T3 and then proceeded to build him up for PvP like I have. If they did do this, then they likely would have the most reliable counter to Doom for this week. Even though Makkari isn't as dominant in PvP as Ikaris, because she doesn't have that iframe ignore, the passive healing, or the really high mitigations, she actually does have potential in PvP because of her insanely high burst damage and due to her very long iframes, as well as her super guard break on her 3rd skill that essentially locks down the character and takes them out before they can do anything, including activating their CTP of Authority with the steal effect that keeps you from getting head rocked. Keep in mind that this super guard break effect on the 3rd skill is only available when you have Makkari's uniform. Also, I tested 3 different builds for Makkari to give you an idea of how she performs in PvP in case you want to build her either PvE, hybrid, or purely PvP. For this first clip, it simulates if I had a PvE build since I have no guard break immunity. This was the least consistent of the builds that I tested for PvP since without guard break immunity, Makkari constantly gets head rocked and her skills get interrupted, so she doesn't end up being in those iframes, which leaves her very vulnerable. Surprisingly though, she can take a hit because of that high dodge and guaranteed dodge, as well as that high base HP when you transcend her. The second build that I tested was the most consistent and was a pure PvP build, so that means it had guard break immunity as well as some kind of shield or invincible. For this particular case, I was using an obelisk with guard break immunity and 4 seconds of invincible. In this clip, you'll notice that I don't get head rocked or not nearly as long or as much as without the guard break immunity, since the only time that really happens is when the opponent has super guard break. Besides that, my skills don't get interrupted nearly as frequently as the other clip where I didn't have guard break immunity. If you're going for a purely PvP build, I would highly recommend going with either a CTP of Authority or a regen. Whichever you choose, it really comes down to preference, though I'm likely going to choose the CTP of Authority since I want that extra mitigation when I eventually make it into the reforged one with the steel effect. You could just as well use a regen if you wanted to, since her base HP is also pretty high and she frequently spams her third skill, which has that 30% heal on it, though I usually tend to save those CTPs for characters that have passive healing. One of the other things that you might have noticed in these clips that makes Makkari good for PvP is that she does have a counter skill on her second skill. It doesn't ignore iframes, but it's still very good when an opponent is out of them. Besides that, her fifth skill is such a long iframe that oftentimes when an opponent goes into their own iframe, she's still in that iframe avoiding damage that when the opponent comes out of it, they basically get one-shotted. In this last clip, I'm testing a hybrid build, which is a CTP of Greed. Normally, I'd say it's a CTP of Destruction, but because she has native penetration in her kit, then a CTP of Greed, similar to Quicksilver, is the one that you would most likely want to go with. This is the CTP that I'm also using for testing in Alliance Conquest, though to be honest, she doesn't really need a damage proc because her base damage is so high and she frequently uses her third skill that has that damage accumulation for damage dealt, making pretty much most of her skills one shot anyway. I'm probably going to be swapping out from this build, but for testing's sake I put it on just to show people how she performs. Cersei is likely the least PvP oriented of the three, but she does have some skills and effects that make her good for PvP. For example, her fifth skill is a full iframe that has super guard break and can potentially one-shot the opponent. Besides that, her fourth skill has a lot of lingering effect and does a lot of damage, as you just saw there. If you're fortunate enough to get her artifact, you can also benefit from the awakening skill having 2 activations or just 1 guaranteed activation if you don't survive long enough. In this first clip, I'm testing a guard break immunity and invincible obelisk to show you what a fully defensive or survival based build looks like. Even though the build does perform fairly well, I found that versus some top metas with high mitigation or survival, especially the ones that have 2 lives, you could benefit a lot from having penetration or a damage proc. And that's exactly what I'm testing in these next 2 clips, where I've equipped a CTP of Destruction, so I can benefit from the penetration on the awakening skill as well as every other skill. But I also have that added proc, which increases her likelihood to take out tankier characters, since more of her skills will essentially become one-shots. Similar to how I built Corvus, the main idea of the build is that you don't really bother with trying to keep Cersei alive, since it's a little bit difficult due to her current kit, but instead giving her that penetration and proc makes it so that she can essentially wipe out a full team in content like Alliance Conquest, where that awakening skill revive mechanic with the artifact of course is really going to shine. After testing both the survival based build and the offensive one, I've noticed that the offensive one was actually more consistent overall, since the defensive one, like CTP of Authority or Regen, if you go that route, or possibly even Transcendence, makes it a little bit difficult for her to stay alive regardless of having those, since top meta characters have a lot in their kit going for them to be able to take her out. Whereas going with Destruction, you're playing kind of a best defense is offense route, where you try to take out the strong character before they get going and take you out. After I finished my timeline testing, I finalized some of my builds. So as you saw previously, I had my Ikaris at rank 4 with a regen, my Makkari is a rank 3 with a CTP of Greed, and I still have to get her uniform to Mythic. I'm kind of slowly doing that one in order to save a Mythic uniform ticket. And my Cersei is rank 21 with a CTP of Destruction. As good as these characters are in PvE modes and PvP modes like Timeline, Alliance Conquest is where they really shine due to their synergy with one another. Knowing how well they performed in the other tests, I immediately take them versus some of the top meta teams in Alliance Conquest. You can see just how easily they were able to take down a Doom with a Colossus support. And funny enough, my Makkari did so much damage that she immediately died from the reflect from Shang-Chi and Colossus. Cersei ended up dying fairly quickly, though because I have a CTP of Destruction build on her, I don't really mind on offense, since I kind of do want her to die semi-quickly, since she'll be able to go into her very powerful Awakening skill with that proc to wipe out the opponent team. This should leave Ikaris as the last one standing to win the match. In the second test, I fight a Doom set with other characters that aren't supports, so another Shang-Chi for the Reflect, and a Quicksilver that goes into his 4th skill fairly quickly to wipe out the opponent team, or in this case my team. But you can see that because of the synergy with Cersei giving Ikaris more mitigation and increased damage on top of his own leadership damage, it makes it so that he can survive that initial burst and take out the opponent team fairly quickly. After seeing just how easily the Eternals team can take down a Doom set, I wanted to see what they could do versus defenders, and as you can see here, it's total obliteration. Since Ikaris and Cersei are energy type, they don't get affected by the reflect, and you would think that Makkari would get affected by it, but because she goes into her 3rd skill so quickly, and it is an iframe, again with that super guard break, it locks down the opponents and keeps her from taking damage, allowing her to burst down the opponent, as well as letting Ikaris and Cersei freely cast their skills to layer on more damage and finish the fight. If you're wondering on a potential team to counter the Eternals, one good team for that is the Warriors of the Sky. Because the Eternals are so heavily offensive, they'll take out the Warriors of the Sky all at one time, which will allow them to all awaken at the same time to take them out in turn. I'm not sure if you'll end up winning overall though, since Cersei can in turn awaken as well and take out the Warriors of the Sky, but they should be able to wipe out the Eternals team. Since I quickly found out that this team can take down 2 of the best sets in Alliance Conquest, that being Doom sets and Defenders, I just had fun testing against some other opponents like Sentry, and as you can see, it wasn't really much competition. Because of Cersei's passive that provides damage mitigation from villain damage to the Eternals, as well as increasing damage versus those villains, then the best team that you can use Eternals for is ones that have a lot of villains on them. So an example of that you just saw was the Mephisto Dormammu team, which is commonly used to counter defenders. So if you're having trouble countering that team, you could potentially use Eternals on them. With the emergence of Wolverine's new uniform and his unkillable artifact, one common team that you might also see is a Doom Wolverine and support, or a 3rd damage character there. So naturally, I had to test the team versus that set to see how it would perform. Even though this team didn't have that Wolverine artifact, the amount of combined damage that Ikaris, Cersei, and Makkari do in a short period of time should be enough to take out Wolverine, and if it doesn't, I always have that fallback with Cersei having the Awakening skill with Destruction. Here's another clip of a similar team, but again with no artifact, just to show you how consistent the Eternals team is. You might have also noticed throughout these clips that Makkari is a little bit hit and miss with Greed, since sometimes she wipes out the opponents fairly quickly, whereas other times she ends up dying herself. It's kind of expected with a Greed build, because that's the trade-off you get. more burst damage and potential to use her in other modes, but she can potentially die more easily as well. This is why I'm considering switching to Authority, though I wish we could see what a Reforged Greed would look like, since it could end up being really good for her. One other thing, I did end up testing Hyperion in the lead position instead of Ikaris on this team, but I found that it didn't nearly work as well since Ikaris is very tanky and the team already has high burst damage, and Hyperion pretty much brings that to the team. He brings more burst damage, but he's less tanky. So ideally, in my opinion, it's best to go with Ikaris in the lead position, and you can save Hyperion for another team since he has a damage buff that applies to all allies as opposed to just Eternals. I'm hoping that testing footage and the build comparisons kind of give you an idea of how to build the characters, but if you're still wondering which way to go, then it really depends what you want from the character. Since I can already comfortably do the PvE content that I want with the characters that I have, I'm opting to build them for PvP. This is especially considering that the Eternals epic quest isn't over and that we will get more characters that synergize with the current characters that we have, which could potentially make the Eternal sets in Alliance Conquest that much more powerful. And that pretty much rounds out this video. If you have any questions or comments regarding the builds or the characters or anything else, then leave them in the comments below, and if you like this content, please consider subscribing and liking, since it helps my channel grow and I can provide you with more content like this. Anyways, thank you for your time and watching, but the video is now over.